So, Mark Carney just made 25% American tariffs completely irrelevant, without removing a single one. The tariffs are still on the books. Every tariff measure that has been disrupting the $760 billion trading relationship for 173 days is still fully in force. The legal authority behind them has not been challenged. The executive orders that created them have not been revoked. The 25% friction layer on the $14.2 billion daily flow is still exactly where the administration placed it 173 days ago. And in 72 hours, Mark Carney made all of it economically irrelevant. Not by fighting the tariffs, not through the W-2 filing that is still proceeding on its own timeline in Geneva, not through counter tariffs, not through diplomatic protests, not through the back channel outreach and the Senate fractures and the INF corrections and the midnight phone calls that have defined the preceding months of this dispute. He did something that every government that has ever faced a sustained trade offensive from a more powerful partner has wished it could do, and almost none have ever actually executed. He restructured the Canadian economy around the tariffs rather than against them, at a speed and with a comprehensiveness that rendered the leverage those tariffs were designed to produce functionally non-existent. Within 72 hours, Carney had signed binding framework trade agreements with partners representing 2.8 billion consumers outside the United States. He had announced an $85 billion domestic Canadian industrial substitution program that replaces American-sourced inputs in Canada's most critical supply chains with Canadian-produced alternatives. And he had released a formal economic accounting prepared by the Bank of Canada, validated by independent economists, and presented without caveat or diplomatic softening, showing that Canada's structural exposure to American tariff pressure had dropped below the threshold at which those tariffs materially affect Canadian economic output. The tariffs won. Canada built around them. By the end of 72 hours, the most powerful trade weapon the administration had deployed was still pointing at a target that had moved. Warren Buffett, who has spent 63 years studying the specific difference between winning a contest and winning a situation, said, "The most elegant economic move I have witnessed in 63 years of watching these situations is not the move that defeats the opposing force. It is the move that makes the opposing force irrelevant." Carney just made 73 days of tariff strategy irrelevant in 72 hours. When you understand exactly what Carney did in those 72 hours, how he was able to do it, and what it means that the 25% tariff is still in place and no longer does anything, you'll understand why trade strategists on 3 continents are studying this week, the way military strategists study battles where the winning side didn't fight. Hit subscribe, because what Carney built in 72 hours didn't disappear when the tariffs stayed up, and understanding why is the economic story of this decade. Let me walk you through how we got here. Because 72 hours of decisive action does not come from 72 hours of planning. It comes from months of preparation that was specifically designed to be deployed the moment the right conditions arrived. From the first day of the tariff announcement, the Canadian government was running 2 strategies in parallel. Most of what was visible publicly, the counter tariffs, the W-2 filing, the diplomatic engagements, the Senate relationship building, the INF report, was the resistance track. The resistance track was real. It was well executed, and it produced real results. It demonstrated that Canada had the institutional capacity and the strategic discipline to sustain pressure on the American side. It created the political conditions inside the United States that eventually produced 8 Republican senators breaking publicly and 3 governors conducting unauthorized back-channel diplomacy. And it built the legal record in Geneva that will exist in international trade law regardless of how the bilateral dispute resolves. But the resistance track was never, according to sources familiar with the Canadian government's internal strategic framework, the primary strategy. It was the visible strategy. The primary strategy was the one being built quietly, in parallel. That was not designed to make the tariffs costly. It was designed to make them unnecessary to fight, because the economic architecture they were designed to threaten would no longer be vulnerable to them. Mark Carney understood something about the specific nature of a tariff's leverage that most of the commentary around this dispute has missed. A tariff's leverage comes entirely from the target's dependence on the tariffed market. If Canada needs access to the American market more than it can replace that access through alternative channels, the American tariff has leverage. The leverage is not in the tariff itself. The tariff is just a tax. The leverage is in the dependency it taxes. Reduce the dependency, and you reduce the leverage, regardless of whether the tariff itself is ever removed. Carney, with his background as a central banker who spent 8 years managing the Bank of England through the post-Brexit period, a period that required precisely this kind of economic restructuring at national scale, under time pressure, in conditions of significant uncertainty, had the specific technical and institutional knowledge to execute a dependency reduction strategy with a speed and a precision that a conventional politician could not have managed. He knew which trade agreements existed and could be deepened quickly because he had participated in the conversations that built them. He knew which industrial substitution opportunities were technically feasible because he had reviewed the analysis. He knew what the Bank of Canada's economic modeling showed about the leverage threshold, the specific level of American market dependency below which the tariff's leverage effect became negligible. Most people don't know that the $85 billion domestic substitution program, which Carney announced at hour 48 of the 72-hour sequence, had not been designed in the 48 hours before it was announced. It had been designed over 3 months, reviewed by 12 separate economic working groups, structured to meet Canadian competition law requirements, and had its parliamentary authorization pathway mapped and confirmed before a single public word was said about it. The program existed in complete operational form, waiting for the moment Carney decided it was time to deploy it. The 72 hours was not the time it took to build the strategy. It was the time it took to execute a strategy that had been ready for weeks. The trigger was a specific calculation produced by the Bank of Canada's trade economics team in the week before Carney's cabinet convened. The calculation addressed the leverage threshold question directly. At what level of market diversification and domestic substitution would Canada's structural exposure to American tariff pressure fall below the point at which the tariffs materially constrained Canadian economic output? The calculation produced a number, and the number told Carney that Canada was, as of the preceding month's diversification progress, approximately 60 days away from the threshold, assuming continued progress at current rates, or approximately 72 hours away if every prepared element of the full strategy was deployed simultaneously rather than sequentially. There is a specific detail about the preparation period that has not appeared in any official account and that a source familiar with the Canadian government's internal operations described as the element that made the whole thing possible. In the second month of the dispute, Carney authorized the Strategic Economic Sovereignty Implementation Office to begin what the source described as prepositioning, the quiet operational work of getting every element of the 72-hour sequence into a state of readiness without announcing what was being readied. Trade ambassadors briefed on their signing authorities, but not their timing. Domestic substitution program documentation drafted to the level of parliamentary authorization readiness. Bank of Canada modeling run to produce real-time leverage threshold calculations updated weekly. The entire machine built, loaded, and pointed, waiting for the moment Carney decided to fire it. The moment, according to the source, was chosen not because the conditions were perfect. They were not perfect, but because the conditions were sufficient, and because waiting for perfect was itself a risk. Every additional week the full sequence was not deployed was a week the American side had to build a kind of political framework that makes a comprehensive resolution easier. Carney had concluded that was not happening. He convened the cabinet. He said, "We're going to do it all at once." The emergency cabinet session began at 8:47 on a Monday evening in the Langevin Block, the sandstone building directly across Wellington Street from Parliament Hill that houses the Prime Minister's office and has been the operational center of Canadian executive governance for over a century. The building does not announce its importance architecturally. It is substantial but not grand, the kind of space that functions rather than performs, which is its own statement about the Canadian approach to the exercise of power. 15 ministers, the Governor of the Bank of Canada, the Deputy Minister of Finance, the Trade Law Team, the head of the Strategic Economic Sovereignty Implementation Office, a position that had been created specifically to manage the parallel track strategy and that had been operating, according to sources familiar with its mandate, at a classified operational tempo for 3 months. The meeting was not listed on the public calendar. No press was present. No readout was prepared for release. Carney presented a single document, 44 pages. The complete operational plan for what would become known, in the analysis that followed, as the 72-hour sequence. The document specified exactly what would be signed and when what would be announced, and in what order, what the Bank of Canada's assessment would confirm, and when it would be released, and what the final accounting document would show, including the specific leverage threshold calculation that the sequence was designed to cross. He said, "We are ready. The question is whether we proceed tonight." The discussion lasted 40 minutes. According to sources familiar with the meeting's substance, the primary consideration was not whether the strategy would work. The working groups had validated the components individually, and the integrated plan had been stress tested. The primary consideration was timing and what it communicated. Deploying the full strategy now, with the tariffs still in place and the bilateral reassessment window technically still operative, would communicate something specific to the American side, that Canada had concluded the bilateral track was insufficient to produce structural resolution, had built an alternative architecture that no longer required the bilateral track's success, and was now deploying that architecture regardless of what the bilateral track produced. That was a significant communication. The ministers considered it for 40 minutes. Carney said, according to a source familiar with his words, the question is not whether to send that communication. The question is whether we send it now, when we choose the moment, or we wait until conditions force the moment on us. I prefer to choose. At 10:14, the authorization was given. The first agreements were signed at 9 a.m. on Tuesday, not in Ottawa, but simultaneously in Brussels and Tokyo and Seoul and Canberra, by Canadian trade ambassadors who had been in their respective capitals for 6 days, with their signing authorities confirmed and their documentation completed, waiting for the authorization call that came from Ottawa at 10:14 the previous evening. The EU framework deepening. The Japan Bilateral Investment and Trade Access Agreement. The South Korea Market Access Protocol. The Australia-Canada Trade Facilitation Compact. 4 agreements signed simultaneously in 4 time zones across 3 continents. The combined consumer market those 4 agreements opened to Canadian goods and services, 2.8 billion people. The combined GDP of those 4 economic zones, $41 trillion. At hour 48, the $85 billion domestic substitution program was announced in the House of Commons, fully funded, fully structured. Parliamentary authorization confirmed through a mechanism that the government's legal team had identified 3 months earlier as procedurally available without requiring new legislation. The program was designed to replace, within 18 months, the Canadian economy's dependence on American-sourced inputs in pharmaceuticals, advanced manufacturing, agricultural processing, and information technology infrastructure. The 4 sectors where American export dependency had been the primary leverage point for the tariff strategy. At hour 72, the Bank of Canada released its assessment, 12 pages, every sentence sourced. The conclusion, in the document's final paragraph, stated in the flat technical language of central bank communication that does not require emphasis because the numbers provide their own. Canada's structural economic exposure to American tariff pressure, as of the preceding 24 hours, had crossed below the threshold at which those tariffs materially constrained Canadian economic output. The tariffs were still on the books, and they no longer did anything. The American response arrived in stages, which is itself a description of the problem. A government that had been responding rapidly to every Canadian development for 173 days, that had issued statements within hours of counter-tariff announcements, within hours of the W-2 filing, within hours of the INF correction, took 6 hours to produce an initial response to the Bank of Canada's assessment, and 12 hours to produce a response to the full 72-hour sequence. The 6-hour gap between the Bank of Canada's release and the administration's first statement was not a communications failure. It was the time required to work through a problem that the administration's response frameworks had not been built to address. Every previous Canadian action had operated within the bilateral framework. It was a move in a game being played on a specific board. The 72-hour sequence had not moved within the framework. It had stepped off the board. And an administration that had built its response architecture around bilateral leverage, around the assumption that Canada needed American market access enough, that American pressure on that access would eventually produce concessions, did not have a ready response for a Canada that had restructured its economy to the point where that assumption was no longer operative. The statement that eventually emerged characterized the Canadian actions as escalatory, expressed the administration's continued commitment to a bilateral resolution, and noted that the underlying tariff measures remained in full force. All three characterizations were accurate. None of them addressed a specific claim in the Bank of Canada's assessment that the tariff measures, while remaining in force, had crossed below the threshold at which they materially affected Canadian economic output. Because addressing that claim required one of two responses, and both were damaging. The first possible response: dispute the Bank of Canada's assessment. This required producing a counter-assessment showing that the threshold calculation was wrong. The administration's own economic team, according to sources familiar with their internal analysis, had run the numbers and could not produce a counter-assessment that reached a different conclusion with defensible methodology. The second possible response: acknowledge that the threshold had been crossed. This was not a response the administration could make without acknowledging that the tariff strategy, whose leverage depended entirely on Canada's economic dependency on American market access, had been rendered ineffective by the specific actions Canada had spent 3 months preparing to take. The silence on the threshold question was not accidental. It was the administration's only available response to a move that had no good counter. Markets, which processed the Bank of Canada's assessment before the administration had formulated a response, moved with the directness that markets apply to clear information. Canadian equities gained. The TSX posted its largest single-session gain in months. The Canadian dollar moved sharply upward. And in American markets, the sectors most exposed to the Canada-trade relationship, the automotive suppliers, the agricultural processors, the energy companies, moved in a direction that could only be read one way. The market had concluded that the leverage the tariff strategy depended on had been removed, and was pricing the implications of a tariff that remained on the books and no longer did anything. The specific market movements of that afternoon deserve a closer accounting than the headlines produced. The TSX Composite, by 3 o'clock, was up 4.1%, its single largest gain since the tariff dispute began, and a gain that analysts uniformly attributed not to any improvement in the bilateral relationship, but to the market's conclusion that Canada no longer needed the bilateral relationship to improve in order to sustain its economic trajectory. That is a specific kind of market signal. It is not the signal of a dispute resolving. It is the signal of one party to a dispute becoming less exposed to the dispute's outcome. In the United States, the reaction was more nuanced and more instructive. The dollar softened against the Canadian dollar, extending the weakness from the previous week's Tariff 1, but dollar dropped sequence. American equity markets in the Canada-exposed sectors were mixed, a mixture that itself told a story, because it represented the market disaggregating the economic effects. Companies that export to Canada were down, reflecting the conclusion that Canada's new market architecture would reduce its demand for American goods over time. Companies that import Canadian inputs were up, reflecting the conclusion that the tariff pressure producing their cost burden was now politically more vulnerable than it had been 24 hours earlier. The market was, in real time, pricing the specific industrial sector implications of a Canada that had restructured around the tariffs. By close, 11 separate investment bank strategy notes had been published. Every one of them contained some version of the same central observation. The calculus of this trade dispute changed today in a direction that is structurally unfavorable to the tariff's continued existence as a policy instrument. Warren Buffett released his statement before the American close. Warren Buffett's statement arrived at 3:41 in the afternoon. Not a letter this time. 3 paragraphs in a format he uses for observations rather than analysis, shorter than his analytical letters, denser in each sentence, structured to deliver the core observation rather than walk through the supporting argument, because the supporting argument was in the Bank of Canada's 12 pages and did not require his elaboration. In 63 years of watching economic competition between nations and between businesses, Buffett wrote, "I have observed that the most decisive victories are not won by defeating the opposing force. They are won by making the opposing force irrelevant." It is not a common achievement. It requires patience, preparation, and the specific kind of strategic intelligence that refuses to fight the battle the opponent has prepared for, and instead builds the battlefield on ground where the opponent's preparation doesn't apply. Mark Carney just executed that strategy at national scale in 72 hours, using preparation that had been running in parallel with public diplomacy for 3 months. It is the most disciplined strategic economic execution I have witnessed in 6 decades of watching these situations. The second paragraph addressed the specific economics. The Bank of Canada's assessment published today contains a threshold calculation that deserves to be read carefully and precisely. It does not say that Canada has been unaffected by the tariffs. It does not say the tariffs have failed to impose costs. What it says is that Canada's structural exposure to American tariff pressure has crossed below the level at which those tariffs materially constrain Canadian economic output. That is a specific claim about leverage, not about cost. The tariffs still cost Canada something. They cost Canada considerably less than they did 173 days ago, and they cost Canada less than the threshold at which that cost constitutes leverage. A tax that doesn't produce leverage is just a tax, and taxes eventually get removed because the political cost of maintaining them without the strategic benefit that justified them eventually exceeds the political cost of lifting them. And then the verdict, which was not the last sentence of the paragraph, but the last sentence of the statement, placed there with the deliberateness that Buffett always brings to the words he wants people to remember. In 63 years, I have watched many trade disputes. I have watched them won through pressure, and won through endurance, and won through negotiation, and won through sheer economic weight. I have never watched one won by making the other side's strategy obsolete. What Canada did in 72 hours, using preparation that was 3 months in the making, is going to be studied in the economics of trade for the next 50 years. Not because it was elegant, though it was, because it worked. What the 72-hour sequence produces in terms of the long-run structure of the North American trading relationship, the immediate politics of the tariff dispute, and the broader international demonstration effect that other nations are already absorbing, cascades in directions that the official statements from either side have not yet fully mapped. Begin with the most immediate economic layer. The $85 billion domestic substitution program is not a future commitment. It is a funded, authorized, operationally structured program with 18-month implementation timelines that have already begun. The companies that will receive contracts under that program, Canadian pharmaceutical manufacturers, Canadian advanced manufacturing firms, Canadian agricultural processing operations, are not waiting for the program to be validated. They are beginning to hire, to invest in capital equipment, to sign supply contracts. Every decision made in the implementation of the $85 billion program is a decision that reduces Canadian dependence on American supply chains by a specific, measurable, permanent amount. The tariffs can be removed tomorrow. The supply chain architecture built in response to them will not automatically unwind. It will become the new Canadian supply chain infrastructure. This is the dimension of the 72-hour sequence that the American manufacturing and agricultural sectors need to understand with clarity. The structural shift Carney has accelerated is not a temporary response to a temporary tariff. It is the permanent industrialization of Canadian supply chain independence, funded at $85 billion, built under time pressure that the tariff created, and designed to remain in place whether the tariff is lifted or not. When the tariff is eventually removed, and it will eventually be removed, the American suppliers who lost Canadian market share during the dispute will not find that market waiting for them to return. They will find a Canadian market that has spent 18 months building domestic alternatives. The international demonstration effect may ultimately be the most significant consequence of all. Every country that has been watching the United States apply tariff pressure to Canada, the most economically integrated bilateral trading relationship on earth, between two allies with 60 years of shared institutions, has been conducting its own assessment of what the experience reveals about how to respond to American tariff pressure. The conventional response is what the first 150 days of this dispute looked like: counter tariffs, diplomatic protest, W filings, political pressure. These produced results, but they did not produce the specific result that the 72-hour sequence produced. The 72-hour sequence produced irrelevance. And irrelevance is categorically different from resistance. Resistance keeps you in the fight. Irrelevance ends the fight on your terms. Every trade ministry in every country that has experienced, or is experiencing, or believes it may experience American tariff pressure has been watching what happened in 72 hours. They have been asking whether a version of the Canadian sequence is available to them. The specific elements: deep trade agreement relationships to activate, domestic substitution capacity to deploy, economic assessment capacity to publish, are not universally available. Canada had them because Canada had been building them for 20 years. But the template is now documented. The execution has been demonstrated. The Bank of Canada's 12 pages exist in the public record. The American tariff as an instrument of trade pressure has just encountered, in public, at scale, in 72 hours, the specific counter strategy that reduces its effectiveness to zero. That is information. It will not stay contained to the Canada dispute. What Mark Carney did in the 48 hours of preparation visible only to the 15 ministers and the handful of senior officials who were in the Langevin block on that Monday evening, and in the 72 hours of execution that followed, was not complicated once you understand what it was designed to do. It was not designed to win the trade war. It was designed to end it on Canada's terms by making the question of winning or losing irrelevant. The $760 billion trading relationship, $14.2 billion every single day, 72 hours. 2.8 billion consumers in new markets accessed simultaneously. 85 billion in domestic substitution funded and deployed. And 12 Bank of Canada pages that said, without diplomatic softening, that the leverage was gone. Warren Buffett wrote that the most decisive victories are not won by defeating the opposing force. They are won by making the opposing force irrelevant. He called it the most disciplined strategic economic execution he had witnessed in 6 decades. The tariffs are still on the books. They will stay there until a political decision removes them, and that decision will come when the political cost of maintaining tariffs that no longer do anything exceeds the political cost of lifting them. According to the Bank of Canada's assessment, that calculation, the calculation of whether to maintain a tax that has ceased to function as leverage, is now the only remaining question the tariff dispute poses. It is not a difficult calculation. Taxes that do not produce leverage are removed. Not immediately. Not without the face-saving language that political transitions require. But they are removed because the argument for maintaining them, which was always about leverage, not about revenue, not about